I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, I read this, they didn't tell me this. They had rented a theater in New York City in the Village, and they were just looking for something to fill it up with.
Yeah.
So, they started singing, and it worked.
So they'd never sung together as a group or a family when they were back home in Ireland?
Not that I know of. I'm sure when they got together with the family they sang, but not as a professional group, no.
Exactly, because I think going back to the material, all the original stuff was literally old Irish folk songs.
Yes, it was. What they did was they just pumped them up.
Which they learned as children.
Yes.
And
they got most of their material, I believe, from Tommy Makem's mother. Tommy Makem's mother was just an incredible woman. I never met her. I was over there just after she died with Tommy Makem, and we watched the film that they did about her and so forth. But she actually was, I believe there was a British radio show called As I Rode Out on a May Morning.
As I rode out on a May morning in the merry month of whatever, I spied.
It's a little different. As I rode out on a May morning right early.
I met my love upon the way, oh Lord, but she was early. And she sang lil-ta-doodle, lil-ta-doodle, lil-ta-doodle day, and she had land the day, and she had land the day, and she land day.
Do you think the other brothers were jealous of the two of them because they were superstars and the other two were the other brothers, weren't they?
Well, I didn't really know the others, I had met them briefly. I actually met Tommy Clancy on an Aer Lingus flying to Ireland. I met Paddy when they were doing those little bars on our neighborhood. I went out behind the bar to get a breath of fresh air, and he was out there smoking his pipe. We had a little talk, but I never really knew them or spent any time with the two brothers. I don't know if they were jealous. I tend not to think so. I think they might have been upset when Tommy Makem left the group. That might have upset them. And then they kept bringing in, cousins and nephews to fill in, and Lou Keelam, an English guy actually, to come in and take his place. So I think they were a little upset when he left.
What triggered him leaving, George?
Oh, I don't know. I highly suspect it was drinking, but I don't know. He went to all the parties with them and everything. He told me about parties they had with the Kingston Trio and after shows and stuff like that. But he never drank, and the other guys drank a lot.
It's pretty obvious that early Bob Dylan songs are all Clancy songs with different words.
Absolutely. Actually, some of the same words.
Well, if you're going to nick a song, you might as well do it properly.
He did a song, Parting Glass, which has some of the exact same words in it. And the same melody.
Did they mind?
But I have to tell you, Liam thought very highly of Bob Dylan. Matter of fact, one day in the car, when Liam was here in Atlanta, we were driving around and we went through a litany of folk singers from the 60s. And he told me what he thought of each one of them. He liked Judy Collins, Ian and Sylvia, on and on, the Kingston Trio. It was very, very interesting. I don't remember every single thing he said about every one of them, but I just remember it was incredibly interesting. I started going to the Village like in 1964, 65, and they would come in and do a show, but they had already left. They weren't living there or anything. And Dylan was long gone by then, type of a thing. But Liam liked Dylan. He liked them all. He liked Tom Paxton a lot. He liked a lot of them. He loved Judy Collins. He loved Sylvia Tyson. I think Liam loved a lot of women.
Yeah. I was going to say that the thing that really gets my goat is that when we were coming up, the big criticism of us as Green Ginger was we were too professional, and for me that was, and now I regard that as a huge compliment. But the Kingston Trio and the Clancy brothers and Peter, Paul and Mary and Ian and Sylvia and even the New Christie Minstrels, all the people who they take the piss out of in Mighty Wind, that fake documentary, which is a very funny film. But
I watched that last night. I did.
Well, the thing about that is that they were the midwives for people like us to get into folk music, because the Kingston Trio. When I was a kid, I was listening to Tom Dooley and MTA and Tijuana Jail, which I knew by heart. By the time that Richard there brought the other albums over. Remember, Richard, number 16 was the album.
I do indeed.
Great album.
We learned how to play with the Kingston Trio. And the fact
Chili
that
Wins.
people looked down their noses at the Clancy Brothers because they weren't real folk was ridiculous to me, you know.
They were probably the most real folk of any of those groups. You know,
and very different to what we now call Celtic music, isn't it?
Oh, 100% different. However, I would say this. It's the Clancy Brothers who introduced Irish Celtic music to the United States. We wouldn't have what we have, which is entirely different today, the music, but we wouldn't have it if it had not been for them.
I think that's true in most of the UK as well, George. I think they were the one that led Irish music into the UK.
Yeah. I mean, people here, and you have to remember, the songs the Clancy's did, whether they got them from Tommy Makem's mother or from their own Clancy's household, these were songs that were laments, and they were sung very slowly and very melodically. When they took them over, they hopped them up. They thought it was like rock and roll.
As a matter of interest from you, George, did you know all the traditional Irish songs already, or were you introduced to them through the Clancys?
Well, I heard, you know, in my neighborhood where I grew up, you could actually get into a bar pretty early. So I was on, you know, the way it was.
Sounds like my sort of place.
I mean, from about back then, the legal drinking age in New York was 18, and you could get into a bar at 14, you know, without too much trouble. Which you knew all the bartenders and the bouncers and everything else. So I had heard a lot of their music in the bars and so forth. And I have an older brother who, when I would sneak into his room, he had some Clancy Brother albums and some Kingston Trio albums up there. And I started listening to those. I said, hey, these are the same songs I'm hearing down the street in the bar. So I got introduced two ways. One by going to the local bars and two by listening to the Clancy Brother albums.
What were they like live? Were they as powerful as their reputation was in the way that they sang and performed?
In my opinion, they sang just like they sang on their records. And they always, when I saw them, even Tommy Makem's Irish Pavilion, they had a pretty good sound system for the times. But they were very one of the greatest things I ever saw. I've seen this done twice, and I've tried it myself, and it doesn't work for me. But I was in the Irish Pavilion one night, and the two of them were performing, and this is a Wall Street crowd that came uptown, you know, bringing their business partners and so forth with them. And the bar was sort of very long and somewhat narrow type of a thing. So when you sat, you were sitting very close to the stage, and it was a very small stage. It could accommodate 4 people, but you know, it was very, very tight. And this one table just kept on talking over them as they were trying to perform. And finally, and the rest of the audience wanted to hear them. But this one table, I would guess there were 8 or 12 people there, was incredibly noisy. And they just stopped performing in the middle of a song, like on cue, and stared at the table. And people kept talking and talking. Until finally I realized the entire bar was looking at them making this noise. It was a fantastic play. It was really wonderful. It was just outstanding. And then, of course, they got the whole deal together. And that's the first time I really met Tommy Makem, because they were singing the song Johnny McEldew. And I knew that song. And I was singing along with them. And Tommy Makem stopped in the middle of the song and said, that guy knows all the words to this song. He was very surprised that somebody would know them all. And so I got to talk to him a little bit. It was just a real gentleman. You know, and the other thing is, I told Lewis, Tommy never took a drink. So Liam was quite the opposite. But even when he owned the bar, he never had a drink. You always see him with a tea or an ice water. It was very interesting.
This is a really ridiculous question. Did you like them?
I love them.
That's an unfair question.
especially Tommy Makem. I mean, the way I got to know Liam well, he came to Atlanta to play in the Atlanta Irish Fest, which I was also performing in, which was kind of weird, because I was doing his songs in my act. But luckily, in those days, he was drinking, so it didn't matter. But So I was his host for 4 days, and my wife and I spent 4 days taking him around Atlanta and to the festival and to restaurants and stuff like that. So that's when we really got to know Liam really well. And he actually invited us to his house in Waterford, which we never got there, unfortunately. Tommy Makem I got to know because twice I toured through Ireland. He used to have these tours, Tommy Makem tours, where we'd tour around during the day and would see historical sites and so forth. And then in the evenings, we'd just sit around. That was at hotels or pubs at night. We'd just go and sit down and play. And it was fantastic. And then during the day, when I took his banjo and played it, he saw that I knew some of his songs. Well, most of the people didn't who were with us. I mean, his sons were there. They all knew them, obviously. And so we got to know each other really well. And we go off by ourselves when we get to different towns and just talk about the music and about life in Ireland and things like that. So I got to know him really, really well. And he was older then. And you'd be walking down the street with him and people would come running out of stores and shops and ask, "Are you Tommy Makem?" You know, he's older looking. He always wore this big, I don't know what you call them in England, but long black coats, a duster we call them here, type of a coat. And people would recognize him walking down the street all the time. It was fascinating, it really was. He was very much admired. And I have to say, some of the greatest times of my life traveling through Ireland with Tommy Makem.
When I'm dead, I in my grave, no costly tombstone do I crave, just lay me down